Hello guys, what's up? It's chapter 27, Walking into Freedom Land, the Civil Rights Movement from 1941 to 1973. We have a lot to talk about and a lot of important stuff. Talk about the Civil Rights Movement itself, Boer versus Brown, Little Rock 9, Emmett Till, Rosa Parks. We'll talk about the sit-ins, Freedom Riders, move on and talk about the March on Washington, D.C., the Civil Rights Act, and then Bloody Sunday as well, among other things. So, causes of the Civil Rights Movement, there was this continuum segregation in public spaces by the 1960s. It all started actually way before the Civil War, but it continued. We have the Jim Crow laws that established different facilities for different places, including parks, libraries, drinking fountains. There was also jobs and housing discrimination. We still have the poll taxes and literary taxes that were introduced during the Reconstruction era right after the Civil War in 1860s, 1870s. There was also intimidation by whites to prevent African Americans from voting in what became known as white primaries. Basically, all this was that only white people were allowed to vote in certain poll places. So over percent of eligible black people were actually not voting because of these taxes used by Southern whites. In 1941, we started seeing some of the civil rights movements taking place. A. Philip Randall, this is during World War I, he threatened to launch a march on Washington, D.C. Roosevelt trying to prevent this form of division in the United States. He passes Executive Order 8802, which prohibit racial discrimination in defense industries and fair employment practices. Remember, this was in part caused by the Great Migration, African Americans leaving the South, moving north and west in search of defense jobs, but they were being discriminated because being blacks. So Executive Order 8806 prohibited that. We also have World War II African Americans veterans who are fighting the Double B. If you recall that, Double B means victory abroad over fascism and victory over racism at home. And sometimes victory over racism at home proved to be just as difficult as fighting the Axis powers during World War II. However, these African Americans come with a more militant spirit, so they're ready to fight to gain their freedoms. In 1948, Harry Truman realizes that segregation is really horrible in the United States, so he desegregates the armed forces after 4 African Americans World War II veterans were actually killed. He then asked Congress to ban the poll taxes, which they don't do and they stall time and time again. These are all causes of the civil rights movement. A major one was that more African Americans were being educated, in particular African American veterans, because of the GI Bill. So now African Americans have more resources. A lot of them are young individuals and they have new ideas, and also the introduction of television, which brings the struggles of African Americans to people's living rooms. And there was more and more whites who started to advocate for equality as well. So these are some of the causes of the civil rights movement. And we're going to see some of the successes and some of the struggles as well. In 1954, we have Brown versus the Board of Education, major Supreme Court case. There's only 4 Supreme Court cases that I ask you guys to remember in my class. This is definitely one of them. So Linda Brown was actually an African-American schoolgirl, but she was forced to attend an all-black school further away from home instead of the white elementary school near her house. So Thurgood Marshall, which is the first African-American lawyer who actually goes to the Supreme Court, he fights for this form of segregation. On May 1954, Thurgood Marshall convinces the Supreme Court that separate but equal was unconstitutional as it denied equal protection under the law to African Americans. If you recall, the second but equal clause was imposed in 1896. In 1896, this was during the Plessy versus Ferguson case. That was pretty bad in my writing there. Anyways, so the Supreme Court agrees that separate but equal was unconstitutional. So they also, in the following year, in 1955, they say that integration in public schools should proceed with all deliberate speed, and that also becomes controversial a little bit later. For now, we're going to stay with the Brown versus Board of Education, which was a huge success for African Americans. However, the Southern people, they respond with the Southern Manifesto in 1956. 101 Southern representatives, first of all, denounce Brown, and they encourage their people around to define the actual Supreme Court case. And here's a major example. In September 1957, the Little Rock 9, this is 9 students that we'll talk about in a minute. This is Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So first of all, Little Rock was actually it's in the South, so it's a segregated city, but some of those schools had been integrated as well. However, Governor Orville Faubus, who is the governor of Arkansas, He uses the National Guard to keep 9 African American students from entering Little Rock High School. Mobs shouted at these students, and the TV covered this event. We see again the impact of TV. We're going to see this time and time again. Ike, who was a president at this time, remember him? That's Dwight Eisenhower. He felt that the Supreme Court should not be defied by a state official. So he sent 1,000 federal troops to protect the African American students and to escort them from one class to another. And he did this for the entire year. So now Eisenhower wasn't necessarily concerned with civil rights. He was more concerned with making sure that the federal government law is being enforced. And that's why he sent these 1,000 federal troops to protect African Americans. Other than that, Eisenhower didn't do much for African Americans in civil rights. However, this incident proved that Southern whites were more loyal to racist customs than the federal law and federal legislation. So this was going to establish a huge battle for African Americans in gaining their equal rights. Here we have a couple pictures. So this is part of the Little Rock Nine. So Elizabeth Eckford, who was this African-American female that you see in the middle, she was one of the 9 African-American students who were going to go to Little Rock High School over here on the right-hand side, on the lower right-hand side. When she arrived there, she was met by this angry mob of not only students, but parents. And also you see this federal troop down here who was harassing them. They were threatening to lynch her because she was entering in a white school. So eventually, like I mentioned, Eisenhower sends these federal troops who at one point had prevented those 9 African-American students from entering the school to escort them from one class to another and protect them as well. So we see the power of the federal government, and this is over civil rights. A year later, actually, the governor of the school, he decides to close the school for an entire year, then to continue to allow African-Americans to integrate in this public high school. So even though they were successful, there was still a lot of pushback by Southern whites. Emmett Till becomes a horrible story. Emmett Till is this young 15-year-old African-American here. He is seen here with his mother. In the summer of 1955, Emmett Till, he is visiting his uncle Moses Wright in Mississippi. Emmett Till lived in Chicago, Illinois. Apparently, Till engaged in inappropriate behavior towards a white woman. He is from the North. He's visiting in the South, so he does not know what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. After much investigation, it seemed like all he did was talk to this girl who was buying something from the store that the girl was working on, and apparently he said something that he shouldn't have. Well, she took offense to it, notified her husband. Her husband and his brother went, found Emmett Till, dragged him from his uncle's home, tortured him, shot and killed him, and then put his body on a river. Till's mutilated body was shown on national TV one more time. We see the role of TV bringing these atrocities home to people's living rooms. The murderers, these 2 white men, were arrested, but were found not guilty by an all-white jury. They were acquitted. Of course, it's an all-white jury and it's in the South. There was very hope that these 2 men were actually going to face any form of jail time. A few years later, these 2 murderers actually admitted to the murder to a Life magazine because Life magazine was looking for a cover story, and they agreed to pay these 2 individuals compensation for a tell-all story of the Till case. This example brings a lot of outrage, not only to blacks but also whites. You see his mutilated body, his face more than anything down here. His mother agreed to have his casket open so that the entire nation could see the face of hatred over racism. And then, of course, we have Rosa Parks as well. So Rosa Parks was part of the NAACP, the National Organization for the Advancement of Colored People. On December 1st, 1955, she worked as a seamstress. She was tired. She got into the bus, which you see over here on the top left-hand side. A white man came in. She was supposed to give up her seat. So some African Americans in certain cities were allowed to sit in the front of the bus, so long as no whites wanted that seat that they were sitting on. Well, this white individual wanted the seat that Rosa Parks was sitting on. The driver asked her to move. She refused. She was arrested. And that's what you see here on the right-hand side. She is being fingerprinted. And this actually, her arrest launches the Montgomery bus boycott. So this took place in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 1st, 1955, she was arrested. On December 2nd, 1955, African Americans agreed that they were not going to take any public transportation in Montgomery so long as these buses continued to be segregated, and they did so for a year. They walked to work. They arranged carpools where people would drop them off to the multiple places. And after a year, the Supreme Court forced Montgomery Transit to desegregate and integrate. And it was not until then that the Montgomery bus boycott ended in 1956. Again, a major success for African Americans. In this incident, the Montgomery bus boycott is what launches Martin Luther King as the leader of the civil rights movement. But even though integration is allowed in the buses, Montgomery continues to be a racist city, and we'll come back to it at the end of the notes. We're going to move on with the sit-ins. So sit-ins, this is February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina at F.W. Woodward's store. So 4 college students pretty much grew tired of being segregated, and you see this picture here over here, and the caption tells you everything. So I'm just going to read it to you. So a group of Negro students from North Carolina, ANC, Agriculture and Technology College, who were refused service at a luncheon counter reserved for white customers, staged a sit-in strike in Woodward's store in Greensboro. That is February 2nd when the story came out. So the students are Ronald Martin, Robert Peterson, and Mark Martin. They are shown staying there throughout the day, and there also says that this white woman was going to sit there, but she just decided to sit somewhere else. So these students were challenging segregation, counter segregation in these restaurants. It started with a few students. I believe it was 4 students. The picture shows 3. And then eventually at the end of the week, it grew to 100. By the end of the month, it grew to 1,000. So a lot of these African Americans, they were refused service. They were harassed. You could see people pouring looks like liquids and ketchup and all kinds of things on their heads. And you also notice that we also see a couple white people here. So it wasn't just African Americans that were staging these sit-ins. Some whites who also called for equality were helping in. A lot of these college students were also beaten. And when the police showed up, the people that were doing the peaceful protests were the ones that were arrested. And you notice this picture on the top left hand side says fountain closed in interest of public safety. So having African Americans being sitting down in this counter apparently was a threat to public safety. We started to see the increase of protests and the increase of nonviolence being used as well during the African American movement and the civil rights. And here's another major example, the Freedom Riders. So the Freedom Riders are a group of both African Americans and whites that was organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Make sure you understand some of these things. So these are grassroots organizations. Grassroots is where individuals themselves establish some form of protest or organize some sort of event to call attention to inequalities. So CORE, which is a group of African Americans and some whites, calls for Freedom Riders. So basically what they do in this map over here, they start driving buses from Washington, D.C. and they're going to go down to all these southern states down here to protest racial segregation in bus station. Now, again, whites do not like this. And we're going to look again at Alabama one more time. In Anniston, Alabama, which is right there, a bus is bombed because they were protesting segregation. The bus then, a separate bus continues, and in Montgomery, Alabama, a mob attacks riders. And even though law enforcement knew that this was going to happen, they refused to intervene. In Montgomery, Alabama, this guy here, James Zerg, if I'm pronouncing his name properly, he was one of the Freedom Riders. He took the bus because he realized that he needed to fight for something that he thought was right. And when the bus reached Montgomery, Alabama, the mob dragged him out, called him the N-word lover, and beat him up. And you see how he was left there. But they continue. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of John F. Kennedy, he dispatched federal troops to protect these riders to make sure that they were able to have their voices be heard. We're going to now move on and talk about Birmingham, Alabama. So in Birmingham, Alabama, May 1963, protesters again assembled in the city because Birmingham, Alabama was the most segregated city in the U.S. This was again organized by a grassroots organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC. Eugene Bull Corner, the city's public safety commission, ordered the police to meet the protesters with force, and they were attacked using dogs, the high-pressure hoses by the Birmingham Fire Department. And King was arrested for leading the protest, and this is where his his famous letter from Birmingham.